And there seemed to be a large gap between what countries were asking for and perhaps recognizing but not really knowing very well themselves, and what an agency like the bank could provide in terms of useful technical assistance or useful lending, useful advice. So really, it seems pretty clear that there's an undeniable opportunity in developing countries for tourism to be contributing to shared growth. There's no other word for it. The comparative advantage that many countries enjoy really does lend itself to tourism being a sustainable part of their economy. And I think where we are at the moment, this sort of nexus that we've reached, is a huge, huge opportunity. And I think all of you in this room are kind of practitioners in some way or another, and I think you probably all recognize the struggle, the sort of uphill struggle with mainstream economics, or just getting tourism onto the agenda of probably the Ministry of Finance in most countries is the most relevant kind of entity. So this research is seen as really the start of a process that will take us from sort of analysis to action, but we're also in in kind of a good position in the bank, because we have now perhaps 40 or so projects around the world where tourism is a pretty big, if not the main component of it. And it's in all continents, and the bank internally, the managers, the task managers themselves are asking for help on how to go about developing tourism in a good way for contributing to shared growth. So it's a good position because we have the opportunity to use some of those finances to actually begin to pilot some of these approaches, whether they're approaches to measure the impact, and the objective of that is to get it on the agenda of the Ministry of Finance so they can affect changes within within the economy to kind of benefit this shared growth approach, or whether it's to position it within the bank as a mainstream approach to development. And I think there's some very, very interesting projects going on at the moment around the bank. So I think with that, I think Jonathan's going to sort of, as perhaps one of the two authors of this report, is going to get into what the findings were. And I think if we can come out of it at the end with some idea about how we move forward, I think that's where we really appreciate your input as we go. But the way forward is what's most interesting for everybody here.
Thanks very much, Sean. I'm John Mitchell from the Overseas Development Institute. Good morning, and thank you for coming. We started this study into looking at the link between tourism and poor people by asking a pretty obvious question: can tourism reduce poverty? Does it lead to flows of benefits from the sector to the poor? Now, like most simple questions, they're the hardest to answer. We, in the course of reviewing something like 330 different documents dealing with this issue, we found remarkably few that actually dealt with that central issue of, if you look at all the tourism spending in the destination, how much of it goes to poor people. Here we've just put actually most of the evidence we found out of this enormous trawl of the literature. In Central Africa, that's guerrilla tourism. That's in some of the post-conflict states, which have very weak supply lines into the tourist sector. I thought it was about as bad as it could get, but we're always surprised in tourism. And I learned yesterday that some very recent work in Cambodia, the DCD, actually there's only 5% of tourism spending in that ancient city remains in the area. But this is very much at the low end of the scale. And it tends to be, we're going to talk later about Gambia and Laos, where there's really quite strong linkages between tourism and the poor. And we're also going to talk about some work in Vietnam, which is a similar pattern to Laos. But the point is that our starting point here is that there are flows from tourism to poor people, but they're different in different places. We then had the tricky issue of how do the flow of benefits move from tourism to the poor? Clearly need for a conceptual model. And for better or worse, this is it. This is our dartboard, which describes the way that the benefits of tourism flow to poor households. The most obvious ones that you'll all know about are on the right-hand side. They're the direct benefits. I'll go into more detail, but that's wages and livelihood issues. Top right is the indirect effects. That's really looking at the linkages between the tourism economy and the non-tourism economy. The fact that the construction sector builds hotels, the fact that tourists eat food which comes from the agricultural sector. And then there's some extremely interesting stuff on pathway 3 called the dynamic effects. And what a dynamic effect is just a longer term effect. As soon as you open a hotel, people come and work in it. That's a direct effect. And the restaurant starts making food orders. That's an indirect effect. But the dynamic effects are the longer term, the general enhancement of skills within the economy, the impact that foreign exchange that a hotel might have on the external value of the currency. That's what dynamic effect is. So let's go into those just in a teeny bit more detail. As I said, the direct effects, this is really tourism workers. This is small tourist businesses. This is the tuk-tuks, this is the guides. Non-labour income. This is a bit of a catch-all really for all that corporate social responsibility type stuff. It's donations, it's joint ventures between the private sector and the community. And then very importantly, the non-economic livelihood effect. So, this is non-financial issues. Money isn't changing hands. If we look at the indirect effects, the key ones, these are sometimes also called secondary effects. This is, as I said, the indirect issues which are where tourism links up with, for instance, the agricultural sector or the construction sector. And also induced effects, that is what happens when you pay tourist workers. They then go and spend their money in the economy, a whole range of different areas. That's captured by induced effects. And then finally, these dynamic effects cover lots of the bigger sort of macro level parts of the economy. So what did we find in the study? I'm going to take you on a very brief tour. You don't have to read 330 different documents. It's got one page to summarise each of the three types of effects. In terms of looking at direct effects, formal sector jobs in some places is really important in terms of the share of the flow of the benefits from tourism to the poor. In countries like South Africa that have relatively high wages and relatively little enterprise, you'll often get 2/3 or up to 3/4 of total benefit from the flow from tourism to the poor. Up to 3/4 of it is just in the salaries paid to tourist workers. In other places, and you'll hear later some work, particularly in Southeast Asia, where wages in the tourist sector are much lower, and the level of enterprise is much higher, the informal sector accounts actually for many more livelihoods than people that work in hotels and restaurants. In terms of these donations, joint ventures, corporate social responsibility, tends to be tends to be rather small compared with these other things like wages and tourism enterprise. But the important thing about it is that it can get to people that aren't going to get jobs in hotels. You can, through, for instance, community joint ventures, people that aren't in the workforce, and aren't likely to, can still receive an income through community trust. So it's not a huge amount of money, but can have a big social impact. Livelihood impact. Important work by Harold and others has shown how ribbon development along the coast, for instance, in the summer, has blocked indigenous communities of fisher folk from accessing the beach and therefore their livelihoods. So the livelihood impacts can be positive, can be negative, but most of the literature covers negative effects. So that's direct effects. The indirect effects, biggest in large, rich, diversified economies, the sort of places we don't generally work. We tend to work in small, poor economies that are quite vulnerable. But even there, the indirect effects of tourism, that means for every pound or dollar that the tourists spend, quite often half as much or even more actually ripples through the economy and has a second indirect impact. So it's a lot of money. Also, from our point of view, and more important actually than the amount of money, is the developmental impact of that. Because quite often you'll find more poorer people, for instance, in the agricultural sector than in the tourist sector. So generating a dollar worth of output in the agricultural sector will have a much bigger pro-poor impact than within, for instance, a westernised hotel. So a lot of money, but crucially, a lot of development impact also. We're going to talk later about the practical issues around the food and craft sector, things that we've, case studies that we've been working on. I think the final point on this slide that I want to leave you with is it's some work that we summarised in an opinion piece. This is the one on linkages that's in your pack and just come out. Linkages are policy sensitive. If you look at an economy, the decision makers can deepen the linkages between tourism and the rest of the economy. And they can do it by having a healthy, well-educated population that's safe, crime destroys linkages, and supports women's rights. And there's some very detailed regression analysis that if as a policy maker you make those kind of choices, obviously there's a whole range of benefits that spring from it, but one of them is much stronger linkages between tourism and the poor. Turning now to these dynamic effects, caught us very much by surprise. I mean, we weren't looking for this in the review, and we had a very strongly destination focus. We thought tourism is what happens in tourist destinations. And it was really an education process for us to realise that what happens in tourist destinations can have a big impact on the rest of the economy. If we look, for instance, at the infrastructure issue, there's some reasonable evidence that, for instance, the cut flower industry in Kenya was stimulated by the increasing air traffic, which was directly caused by tourism into Kenya, which had the impact of, as the volume went up, the air freight rate reduced, which made it viable to export cut flowers from Kenya to Europe. So it's not a direct link there, but it's an example of where improving infrastructure initially for tourism can have an impact elsewhere in the economy. Some recent work that's been done in the bank, this yellow brick road to export diversification. I think I saw it about 3 weeks ago, and I find it a fascinating idea that one of the advantages of tourism that you have over other economic sectors is that it brings the international market to you. And one of the effects of that is that indigenous entrepreneurs can see what people like and don't like. They can get to understand and taste the international market without having to go anywhere. And the result of that is that they learn from an international view what they're good at and what's going to sell in the international export markets. The place I think I saw that was in Luang about 3 weeks ago, where in the past I've seen people selling some great sort of textiles, silk, to tourists. And that, as we were going to talk about lectures, a very important local impact. What I saw very recently was the move to actually exporting quite a lot of that stuff. They're not waiting for tourists to come to sell to them. There seems to be a move towards recognising this is really good, so why don't we try and export much larger volumes into Thai, European, American markets. The dynamic effect of tourism. The issue of tax, traditionally we've often been told that tourism doesn't pay much tax. In fact, it costs the exchange quite a bit. What we found, there's not very much analysis of this, but it seems that because of the visibility of tourists, they tend to get taxed at the airport, at the hotel, at the restaurant. And if you look at the where in a tourist destination where the tax comes from, quite a high proportion seems to come from tourism. And that of course benefits the poor because it's then used to finance welfare programs that they're beneficiaries of. A bolt from the blue really that a booming tourism industry can hurt poor people. And this is really sprung from some extremely innovative computable generalized equilibrium modeling, which is really modeling the whole economy. And it's this effect that is called Dutch disease. Not as I learned recently in the Netherlands, it's got something different there. But what it is, it's usually applied to, for instance, the resource sectors like oil. But you discover oil, you discover tourism, and you get this surge of foreign exchange coming into a fragile economy. And the impact of that is to push up the value, the external value of your currency. Currency appreciates. And the impact of that is that everything else being equal, your exports become less competitive. And in a lot of fragile, poor, peripheral economies, the sort of places we work, poor people are exporting agricultural goods. That's what a lot of the export basket is. And suddenly, for no fault of their own, it's potentially possible for their agricultural exports to become less competitive, and for them to suffer a welfare loss. Now, I think the important thing about this is just to be aware of it, that having a booming tourist sector, you've got to be very aware of what's happening in the rest of the economy, because most of the economy isn't tourism. Fascinating analysis that was done in Tanzania modelled the effects of this and then showed, I think very convincingly, that, for instance, if you have a rural roads program, you completely reverse that negative impact on the rural poor resulting from tourism growth. So this isn't an argument not to do tourism, it's an argument to be aware of what these impacts somewhere else in the economy are, and the fact that there are policy measures that you take to mitigate the negatives. So that was your very quick flash through this literature. What did we learn from them? Well, part of it you can actually see in a briefing note that we produced. This is briefing note 22 that's just come out for today, actually. But in summary, we learned that there's more evidence available than we thought. There's a lot of stuff out there. It's not a quantity issue. It's much more a quality issue. It's very fragmented. It's got brilliant work going on in these very separate, very well-defined areas. And we weren't aware of quite a lot of it. And it's quite clear when you look at who's citing who that other people also suffering the same thing. The result of this is there's a real lack of a coherent body of knowledge that we have in many areas. And just at a very basic level, basic definitions of what tourism is, who the poor are, when they're not shared. And it's extremely difficult when you're trying to pull all this literature together and compare. Are the different findings because different destinations are different, or simply the different definitions of these different places? I'm conscious of time and also the temperature, so I'm going to be very, very brief on this. But we looked at a whole range of different ways of measuring the impact of tourism. We looked at input output models and tourist satellite accounts and regression analysis, some of the equilibrium modeling and value chains. And one of the things we found is that no one method, no one tool really measures everything. And what I've done with this red line is just superimposed on our dartboard as we show with the value chain analysis that you're going to hear about soon. Very much destination-based value chain analysis. It doesn't cover everything. It covers the tourist sector really well. When you're doing a value chain analysis, you're going to talk to people in hotels. It covers a bit of the indirect effects. You talk to hotels and find out where they get their food from and where the company that built the hotel came from. But there's a gap in part of the indirect or secondary effects, and quite often value chain analysis misses the dynamic effects, as I was saying earlier. We seem to be talking a lot this morning about convergence, and I'm not sure if this is contrived. I think not. But we discern a convergence of these different methods for looking at the link between tourism and poor people in the local economy. In the past, economic models have always been very strong in terms of looking at these sectoral linkages. Economists aren't the kind of people to say, I'm only going to look at tourism, they look at the whole economy. But in terms of welfare, they've tended to look at aggregate welfare of the whole economy. They haven't tended to look at poverty-reducing impacts. What we found with some of these SAM, which is social accounting metrics, and some of the very innovative equilibrium models coming from Nottingham, is that they're really addressing that. They look at these intersectoral linkages, but pulling it into a much more pro-poor part of the chart. Stuff that we started in ODI, we started at very much this end, obsessed by poverty, but not really looking at the intersectoral linkages. And we see this sort of move up when we suddenly realise that intersectoral linkages aren't just craft. That it's a bit more significant than that. This might be a bit of a parody, but poor old master plan sitting down there, it's not looking very well at thoroughly at intersectoral linkages often in the traditional master plan. And quite often, apart from a few passing comments about more tourists mean more tourist workers means less poor people, very, very rudimentary poverty analysis. But even there, some really quite innovative recent master plans that are trying to get up to where we want to be. We want to be here, we want to be with an analysis with tools that can tell us about the link between tourism and the rest of the economy, and the link between tourism and poor people. So that's the end of your methodology lecture, and I'd like to hand now to Sean to talk about some of the policy implications from our analysis.
As Jonathan was going along there, it strikes me that one thing we have to try and do is begin to separate this policy implication issue. It seems that there are implications within development organizations as to how they view tourism, and there are implications for governments at the national level, the regional level, and the local level, all who can influence policy as to how they make space for, as we're calling them, the poor, to participate more in the tourism economy that's happening. And it seems that it boils down to, well, at some level, if you then go towards implementation and the action part of it, it really boils down to four things that are prerequisites for people to participate in the tourism economy. Some sort of access to land or a place to do business, some sort of access to finance or credit, some sort of access to skills necessary to do that business, whether it's just running a business or whether it's understanding the tourism business, and then access to markets, whether they're local or international, or but access to markets. And it seems that at a practical level, if we can use projects, interventions, advice, to be talking to policymakers about addressing these issues, we might make some progress. And I'm just back from Nairobi this morning, and earlier in the week, I managed to have half an hour with the Minister of Finance there, who just presented a new budget. But Kenya has a Vision 2030, as they're calling it, which is trying to make them a middle-income country by 2030. And they've positioned tourism as one of the pillars of this growth. And they've made some fairly ambitious projections about the kinds of volumes that they want, the kinds of employment that they want. And when we started to get into the discussion about involving more Kenyans and more, perhaps say community-based people, rural people in this economy, and we started to discuss this issue about access to land, access to finance, and basically he said, it's within his power to do this in the budget, to make perhaps a training budget, to create some sort of development fund that gives them access to finance or credit, to change perhaps the regulatory framework around land ownership, to create perhaps more or encourage the creation of more viable entities. If it's a sort of wildlife-based asset that you're looking at, then clearly 5-hectare plots is less useful than 50,000-hectare plots that might viably support populations of wildlife that people can come in and pay to see, just like a national park, basically.